Hello everyone, this is Armadius, and today I want to experiment with a slightly different video format. So a while ago I wrote an essay for fun, and someone read it and told me to narrate it and add a PowerPoint. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. Now I will link to my essay in the description, but do note that I'm not just going to be reading off of my essay for this video, because while making the PowerPoint, I actually did a little bit more research about this topic that I was not bothered enough to add to the essay. So here you have it, Kaliningrad's constitutional future. So let's start with a map of the EU. Now there's quite a few spots you can see that are surrounded by the EU but are not part of it. For example, the UK because Brexit, Norway because fishing, the Balkans because broke, Switzerland because absolute neutrality, but these places are not our focus for today. Our focus today is this little bit. This bit of Russia that's surrounded by the European Union and not part of it. And this little bit of Russia is named Kaliningrad. And today we're talking about the Oblast, or the Russian region of Kaliningrad, not just a city. It's kind of like a New York City, New York kind of deal. Formerly known as Königsberg, it is a Russian exclave bordered by the Baltic Sea to the west, Lithuania to the north and east, and Poland to the south. Its former name comes from a time when Lithuania, Poland, and Königsberg were all part of the Kingdom of Prussia, the predecessor to modern-day Germany, and the region was known as East Prussia. But then, in 1945, Königsberg and the surrounding areas were annexed by the USSR. After the fall of the USSR, Poland and Lithuania went independent, but Königsberg remained under Russian control as the newly formed Russian Federation took over control of the area. And from 1945 to present day, the Soviets and Russians have largely displaced the original population that had consisted of mostly Germans, Lithuanians, and Poles. While these three ethnic groups are still present in the region today, they are a tiny minority, only adding up to about 2% of the local population. And of these three groups, the Lithuanians make up the largest part. The rest of the populace comes from mostly Russia, as well as other former USSR countries like Azerbaijan, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Belarus, Ukraine, and even some Tatars from various ex-Soviet states. Russian is obviously the dominant language, but there are still tiny pockets of German and other languages that are spoken. Now, I'm not saying this is gonna happen, but I am just imagining a theoretical scenario in which Kaliningrad did somehow go independent. So if you're from the Russian government and you're watching this, don't freak out. I'm not encouraging people to do this, just imagining some sort of alternate universe in which it did happen. And ideologically, it does kind of make sense as well, because people from Kaliningrad are described as spiritually closer to the rest of Europe than Moscow. And for simplicity, I'll be referring to Kaliningrad as Kalin from now on, because Kaliningrad is in and of itself a tongue twister. So how would it fare as an independent country, and are there sentiments in the Oblast to do so? I shall try to answer these questions one by one and then some. Firstly, let's assume that this new government is pro-EU and is fairly liberal and socialistic, much like the governments of Denmark or Scotland, and that somehow Russia is okay with this independence declaration. Now, of course, that would not be the case, considering Russia is clinging onto Colin for dear life because of its strategic position right next to Poland, and as such, Russia can gain indirect access to Central and Eastern Europe, but we are imagining a best case scenario here. Not to mention that the Russian government has literally installed missile systems in Colin in as recently as 2016, but I digress. If it somehow goes independent, the first question would be, what happens to the name? Would it retain its current name Kaliningrad, or would it go back to Königsberg, or what if it would take my short form for the full name Colin, or go with something else entirely? Given a pro-EU government, it was almost certainly not retain its current Russian name, and given the current German presidency of the EU, Königsberg would certainly be preferred, but what would the locals think of this decision? Would the Russian majority feel that their Russian ancestry and language has been undermined entirely? Well, according to an article from 2017, it describes its people as the descendants of peasants from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, are without strong ethnic attachments and have commonly styled themselves as the people of Königsberg. But personally, I think that Königsberg would be the ideal name, given that the local political parties that had tried to campaign for this very name change. And on the topic of language, how would the language of Königsberg change? With other secession events, it is obvious that one cannot change the language of a country overnight. Scotland is obviously retaining Scottish English, and were Texas to leave the United States, I'm not saying that it's going to, but if it were to happen, I doubt much would change linguistically other than a greater representation for Spanish. I can't see them making Czech or German co-official, but I digress. The point is, it's very difficult to just change the language of a country, and those who do so tend to be viewed as dictators or authoritarian. With a liberal and free government, obviously they don't want to be seen as dictators, so it seems that the obvious move is to just continue and use Russian. The question now is, would they switch to a Latin-based script like Kazakhstan did, or would they continue to use the Cyrillic script? Now, with a pro-EU government, it would make sense that this new country would seek to sever its ties with Russia, so a Latin script Russian is possible. And now here's where this theoretical new Khalid Russian really shows its similarities with Darija Arabic, spoken in Morocco and Algeria, in that it uses a script that's similar to the standard language and has lots of loanwords. In this case, Kalinian, as we will call it for now, will be taking loanwords from the languages of its neighboring countries, Polish and Lithuanian. And perhaps due to mass media and local pro-German sentiments, even German vocabulary as well. And like with other European languages, some English words will also enter the local lexicon because of the widespread usage of English online and indeed in the European Union. New local jargon and slang based on larger immigrant communities of Poles and Lithuanians will appear, just like it has done in Sweden with Syrian migrants. The base grammar and syntax would obviously still be Russian-based, but it would evolve eventually into a Slavic language that is mutually unintelligible with Russian, just like what geographical non-proximity had done to Romanian compared to the other Romance languages. So that's language solved, but what about currency? Of course, a pro-EU government would be keen to adopt the euro, and on one hand, a country does not need to be in the EU to use a euro, see Montenegro. But on the other hand, it may lower trust from the EU and hence increase waiting time for accession if a country uses their currency without their explicit consent. That said, Montenegro, despite this euro usage, is on the list to joining the EU alongside Serbia in 2025. So in this limbo period, what could they do? Well, they could mint some Colin rubles or some sort of dummy currency pegged to the Russian ruble or the US dollar and set up a central bank for it. But honestly, the most likely scenario is that they would have to use an interim currency for a while, considering the fact that Croatia joined the EU in 2013 and is still using their own currency, unfortunately. Now, would it fit the Copenhagen criteria? If the government is pro-EU, like the Scottish one, of course it would want to. A free market economy, rule of law, democracy, human rights, etc. It would be quite a stark difference to its former owner from the Northwest. What about debt? According to EU debt criteria, a country must have a budget deficit to GDP ratio of 3%. If we take the national average, a minus 1.4%, it will pass for this criteria even better than countries like, say, Romania. However, even if we take the national public debt 10.6%, it may still have a good chance of fulfilling it because its unique industries make it far richer than some other oblasts of similar size or population. Regardless, even Croatia did not fulfill the criteria initially upon accession. However, soon after, the single market, as well as decreased spending for some time, allowed it to do so. And if we look at the current statistics, we can see that for its size, it is quite formidable compared to other nations seeking to join the EU. Colin has a nominal GDP of $7 billion US dollars, amounting to roughly 7,000 US dollars per capita. In Europe, that GDP per capita would place it snugly below Serbia, but its nominal GDP would actually place it above Montenegro and slightly below Kosovo. So if Serbia and Montenegro could join the EU in 2025, there's no telling that Colin couldn't do the same. Plus, if the Colin government shows itself as a poorer region trying to rid itself of Russian influence, the anti-Russian, or at least Russian skeptical, EU may even give out subsidies to help it out. Point being, Colin, at least in terms of criteria, would not struggle much to get into the EU. It's just a matter of time. And if you want to point out Turkey as a country that wants to join the EU, definitely not under Erdogan. That's all I'm going to say about that. Now, the economy. Colin, as it stands, is renowned in Russia and indeed the world for being the biggest exporter of amber, that yellowish-orange gemstone-like thing, which is actually tree resin, but I digress. Even my mom bought some of it when traveling to Russia. It is estimated that Colin owns about 90% of the global amber reserves. At the moment, Russia takes the raw amber from Colin and processes it, and then sells it to the world. Upon independence, Colin could do the processing right there in their own country. It's a similar argument to its Scolin's oil. Colin could be the global exporter of amber. As for the other industries, there are also auto part producers, as well as shipbuilding facilities, food processing, ion thruster development apparently, and manufacturing of electric propulsion systems, as well as producing satellite receivers and nanomaterials. Of course, many of these companies are state-owned by Russia, not Colin. So upon independence, it seems that most, if not all of them, will move out. there is a silver lining in that neighboring countries might now be keen to invest in the colony, and once there's enough capital, people in Colin could start to build their own enterprises. Fishing is also an important regional industry, but what I think makes Colin ideal for independence is the fact that it has a big power station that can power the entire country slash oblast without depending on electricity imports. This means that Colin does not need to import power from indeed Russia or elsewhere. Energy stability is high. And this is also part of the rationale behind Texas independence, because Texas has its own electric grid separate from the rest of the country. It doesn't have to be worried about the US government cutting off power to the states. What about military defense? It would undoubtedly need its own army, seeing as Russia could snap and annex it again with little notice. Now, I'm no expert on defense, but it seems some sort of system mimicking that of Poland or Lithuania could work. The missiles deployed in Coland, I see no reason why Russia wouldn't take it back, but in the very, very unlikely event that they are retained, Colin could keep them and use it as a means to join not just the EU but also NATO. Slightly far compared to all the other members, but it's fine. The population in 2010 was around 941,000, and while neighboring countries seem to show a decline in population, the fertility rate of Colin has actually increased steadily from 1.11 in 2000 to 1.57 in 2017. Add that to the fact that accession to the EU will mean free flow of people, and many people from all over Europe will be keen to move in and see what's going on. The population will be expected to increase. For the first few years, the demographics in terms of percentage will probably largely remain the same, except some ethnic Russians who are patriotic to the motherland will probably move out and return to Mother Russia. However, over the years following, it can be predicted that the proportion of Poles, Lithuanians, and Germans will increase, as well as other Europeans like Latvians, Estonians, or even Slovakians. One thing I'm interested in, though, is whether it would attract pro-EU Russians to move there. As it stands, most pro-EU Russians for work or otherwise reside in big Russian cities like St. Petersburg or Moscow. Would Colin, a pro-EU former Russian country, attract these people to move there for good? And when I say these people, I mean people that constantly move between the EU and Russia for work, like businessmen or international models, for example. This brings me on to another issue, land. Colin is not big. It is half the size of Belgium and only barely larger than Montenegro. That said, there are countries that are smaller but equally as influential in the EU, like Malta and Cyprus. However, to encourage economic growth, reclamation in the Baltic Sea seems like the only reasonable way to gain more land. And while one could point to Hong Kong as an example of a small but rich place, it must be stated that position matters a lot too. Hong Kong is considered the gateway to China. Colin isn't quite the gateway to Russia. The country would obviously be very friendly with Lithuania, Poland, and Germany, but it may not completely and entirely remove all relations from Russia. That said, the relationship would be as equals rather than subordination. It would also seek to establish trade with many other Western nations like the US, Canada, and Australia. English and German would be taught in the schools alongside Kalinian, and after a few years, or maybe more than that, a standardized Kalinian dictionary would be released. Textbooks and such would be printed in Kalinian as the influence of Russian slowly fades away. And Colin, or Königsberg, would establish itself as a new nation born from the remains of wars from times long gone, with Slavic, Baltic, and Germanic cultures combining to create a distinct people group that will be celebrated into the European Union. So now the final question, is there a desire to do so? Well, yes and no. Obviously, the Russian government is highly against the idea, and in my essay I write that an opposition leader was arrested a few years back, but I was actually looking at an opposition leader from Free Ingria and not any Kaliningradian organization. That said, in 2017, several members of the BRP, or the Baltic Republican Party, were arrested, and just April this year, they were sentenced to several years in prison. And the leader of the Baltic Republican Party, Mr. Alexander Orsholovich, was actually sentenced to 8 years just for being the leader of the BRP and staying in Kaliningrad. Regardless, from what I've read, these groups that have formed for Kaliningradian independence, or at least semi-independence, are anti-Russian, pro-German, and indeed the concept of being free from Russia is starting to come up again after the very brief surge of nationalism post-collapse of the USSR. That said, the article was from 2017, so who knows what has happened in the meantime. I have also seen sources claiming high support for remaining under Russian control in Tallinn, but that one is even older, from 2007. 13 years can change a lot of things. Now, in my essay, I write that the opposition leader that was arrested was of Russian descent with a generic Russian name, Andrei. Now, that's not true because, as you can see on the screen, the opposition leader arrested was named Artem Zolotarev of Free Ingria, and neither does the BRP leader have the name Andrei. Regardless, my point still stands that instead of the unique Baltic Germanic Slavic identity that I suggested, it might perhaps lean towards a mixture of the latter two, Slavic in ancestry, Germanic in ideology, just like I had mentioned earlier. I should mention that I do not endorse the Baltic Republican Party in any manner, because their plans to form a fourth Baltic Republic is simply impossible. By definition, the people of a Baltic Republic speak a Baltic language, so a language linked to Estonian, Latvian, or Lithuanian. Russian is linked to none of those. Therefore, if a republic were to form in Kaliningrad, it could not and would not be classified as a Baltic Republic solely because of geographical location. Furthermore, there are some members of the party who genuinely advocate for the Kingdom of Prussia to be reinstated. For example, in the image on the left, this group of people who are self-proclaimed members of the BRP are holding up banners and flags with Prussian imagery on them. And thinking of reviving a monarchy in the 21st century is just unthinkable and, simply put, ridiculous. So now you might be wondering, where did I get the name Andrei from? Well, it's this person, Dr. Andrei Klemyshev, the rector and lead scientist at the Kent Baltic Federal University, the main university in Kaliningrad. He, along with some other scientists, started a course called The History of Western Russia, for which Dr. Klemyshev also wrote most of the textbooks on. And he was accused of treason, academic separatism, and seeking to split the self-consciousness of Kaliningrad's young people from Great Russia. And some people even called on the Russian authorities to dismiss him from the university. It should be noted that as of this recording, in November 2020, Professor Klemyshev is still working at the Kent Baltic Federal University as the president and the deputy head of the education board, and has not been dismissed as some had advocated for earlier. Will Kaliningradian independence happen? Well, never say never, but without a doubt, Scotland, maybe even Wales, would be leaving the UK before there's even a chance of that happening. And another barrier to the independence of Kaliningrad from Russia would be religion. The Orthodox Church is highly pro-Russia, and while 56% of the population are either spiritual or atheist, 30% of the population is Orthodox. Therefore, this alone might cause some divide in society with regards to separatism. So until either Putin softens his stance on Kaliningrad and the EU in general, or Putin steps down and is replaced by someone with fewer anti-EU sentiments, independence of Kaliningrad from Russia seems very unlikely. But if it does happen, I suppose the Germans can breathe a sigh of relief and think to themselves, "Welcome home, Königsberg." So that's the end of the essay, but what else is there to talk about? Well, the flag. In previous slides, I was using the current Kaliningrad flag, which is this tricolor of red, yellow, and blue, and a castle in the top left corner. However, when the idea of a Kaliningrad flag was being conceived, two other designs were also being floated around. The first one is like the Scottish flag, but with a yellow background instead of dark blue one behind the St. Andrew's cross. And the other one looks quite like the Sierra Leone flag with a green, white, and dark blue tricolor. Now, if Kaliningrad were to change its flag post-independence, I would personally prefer the tricolor, the Sierra Leone-esque tricolor. However, there is no historical precedent of any country seceding from the Russian Federation. Sure, there were a lot of countries leaving the USSR, however, as far as I'm concerned, no country has seceded from the Russian Federation, and therefore, flag-wise, we don't really know what's going to happen. Tell me in the comments below, what do you prefer as a flag for an independent Kaliningrad? So, is there some newer information regarding Kaliningrad? Because all my research have been based on stuff from 2017 and before? Well, there is. For example, this article from 2019 that says there is a creeping Germanization of Kaliningrad. According to film director Vladimir Fokin, he went to Kaliningrad for a film festival and saw a lot of German features that were atypical in a Russian city like Kaliningrad. For example, redecorating Russian buildings in the Königsberg style, and apparently changing the name of streets from Russian to German and the signs from Cyrillic to Latin script. Now, I don't know if that's true because I've never been there, but if any of you live there, let me know. Is that true or not? Another bit of news, this time from only 4 months ago, is that the coronavirus pandemic has caused Kaliningradian citizens to become so poor that they can no longer afford to buy food. And it has been floated around that there should be a Polish annexation referendum. And as far as I'm concerned, there has been no official governmental response from either the Polish or the Russian governments. But it seems unlikely that something like this would happen, according to Russian military experts. And there's this article from 2 months ago, wherein a political commentator claims that were the current Belarusian regime to be overturned, the Russian government would hand over the Russian exclave to the enemy, which I'm assuming means Europe or the EU. Now, whether that's actually going to happen is debatable at best, considering I have seen no similar claims on the internet. However, this is still something to look out for, and obviously Belarus is another place to look out for as well. And only 5 days ago, a lot of reports have come up stating that Vladimir Putin, the current Russian president, is going to step down because of health concerns and apparently getting Parkinson's disease. And the Russian government denies this, but who knows what's going to happen in the upcoming days. So that's the end of my interpretation on what's going to happen to Kaliningrad in the upcoming years. Next time on the show, another bit of Russia with a non-Russian former name, and a really cool Nordic cross. Like and subscribe, pray to the deities above that I'm actually gonna follow through on making the second episode, because I am really busy right now. I literally have a test tomorrow. Regardless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.